In this last series, you'll have seen us sailing 3,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean on a Leopard 44 catamaran. That was a stark contrast to the boat Florence, our 37-foot monohull that we have lived aboard for the last 8 years, sailing around the world and crossing 5 oceans on her. So in this video, we're going to compare the two boats and what we learn about the crossing on the catamaran.
We're often asked which type of boat we would prefer for ocean cruising, a monohull or a catamaran, and until now we've always said, well, we can't answer the question because we don't have experience of sailing on both. Well, now we do, so we're going to give our opinion on that hot topic. And we're also often asked, are we going to sell Florence and buy a catamaran? And so we'll answer that question here as well. What we share here is just our personal experience based on our experience with mostly one monohull and one catamaran. We are experienced sailors, but we are not experts.
Our opinions won't be the same as everyone's, and before we dive into this, we want to make it clear that we don't believe that there is a perfect boat and that all boats are a compromise.
For a bit of context, we'll start by sharing some information about the two boats that we are comparing.
First, Florence. For those of you who've not followed our circumnavigation on YouTube, Florence is an Oyster Heritage 37. She's 40 years old. She has a solid fiberglass hull with a balsa cord deck. She's 37 foot long with a 3/4 length fin and skank keel configuration and a keel step mast. She's a fairly simple, traditional blue water cruiser, and over the years we've worked to set her up as best we can for ocean sailing as a couple.
The catamaran is a Leopard 44. She's around 10 years old. Previously was a charter catamaran in the Caribbean. She's got a fiberglass hull with a balsa core throughout, and although it's called a Leopard 44, it's actually only 42.5 feet long. It's primarily designed as a charter boat, providing a comfortable holiday platform. We're comparing sailing across an ocean on these boats. We're aware we're not completely comparing apples with apples because a similar sized monohull to the catamaran would likely be more comfortable and have a better performance than Florence, but this is the experience we have.
We'll address the comparison with 4 categories: sailing performance, sailing feel, sailing comfort, and all-weather ocean sailing capability and safety. You've probably been told, like we have, that catamarans are faster than monohulls, and so you'd expect a similar sized catamaran and monohull setting off across an ocean at the same time that the catamaran would get there first, right? But how did that work out in reality?
Now bear in mind that we are comparing a 42-foot catamaran with a 37-foot monohull. We've got our average speeds. So for the Leopard, the catamaran, we averaged 5.94 knots crossing the ocean from the Canaries to St Lucia this time round. But last time when we crossed from Cape Verde to St Lucia on Florence back in 2016, we averaged 5.76 knots. So we would expect a 42-foot monohull to be faster than our 37-foot Florence, and therefore in downwind ocean sailing conditions, the difference between a cruising monohull and a cruising catamaran is negligible, or possibly even in favour of the monohull.
We found similar results when we sailed across the Pacific Ocean at the same time as friends on a Lucia 40, so that's a 38-foot catamaran, and that was a big passage, 4,000 nautical miles from Panama to the Marquesas. And the time difference between us then was a day, but when you think about the distance, that's actually very small, and they did motor more than we did, so again, similar results. And then across other oceans, we've been sailing against friends on an Outremer, and because we've been going downwind, they've chosen to zigzag, and so we've actually arrived at a very similar time again.
Because we went dead downwind more direct, and they had to zigzag to make the best use of their sails.
So why wasn't the cat a lot faster?
Well, the cat that we were sailing, like most cruising cats, has very swept back shrouds, and that prevents you from letting the boom all the way out, square to the wind, so it limits how effectively you can use the mainsail when sailing dead downwind. In fact, it was so limiting to that we actually stopped using the mainsail altogether.
Yeah, we tried sailing goose wing, so with the main out one side and the genoa out the other, but the trouble was because the mainsail was so close to the centre line of the boat, we would often have the mainsail jibing back and forth. Not the boom, because that was attached to a preventer which stopped that happening, but just the stress of the battens on the mainsail slatting back and forth was causing problems, and potentially the reason that we broke 2 of them.
We could have sailed a zigzag course to allow the mainsail and genoa to be used on one side, but we could only manage 120-degree wind angles. Otherwise, any lower than that, then the mainsail just shaded the genoa so that it just wouldn't fill because there's no wind in the lee of the mainsail. So then it would be flapping. Zigzagging those angles to use the mainsail and genoa effectively would have doubled our distance to sail through the water. To keep the same crossing time, we'd therefore have had to double our speed from 6 to 12 knots. And without factoring in having to increase our speed, sailing those angles would also change our angle to the waves. Instead of sailing down them, we'd have been sailing across them, which would have led to an uncomfortable corkscrew motion on the boat.
Some catamarans do have twin furling head sails, but that is quite an unusual sail setup for a catamaran.
When sailing a boat that is not a high performance boat, therefore most cruising boats, the most effective way of making progress across an ocean is to sail as direct a route as possible towards your destination. And when sailing downwind across oceans in the trade winds, that often means sailing dead downwind. And the most effective sail plan for that is twin head sails poled out either side to enable you to show the most sail area to the wind and also to be easy to furl in the case of a squall.
The Cat is definitely much faster on a reach, and we found that to be the case when we've sailed Florence against other catamarans on passages around the world. But then Monohull is faster upwind.
For the route that we took on our circumnavigation of the world, the most common wind angle was for us to be sailing dead downwind in the trade winds with poled out head sails. Now on a monohull that does give another problem because it induces a lot of rolling, so much so that on Florence we nickname it poling and rolling. Now that wouldn't be as much of a problem on a cat, but we'll get to that in a later section.
So sailing performance is often the biggest factor when it comes to comparing a catamaran and a monohull. But when it comes to ocean sailing, we haven't found it to be a big enough factor to be something that we would consider if we were choosing between a cat and a monohull for ocean sailing. So what are those factors that we would consider?
Comparing the feel of sailing a catamaran to sailing a monohull across the ocean, the catamaran doesn't get affected anywhere near to the same extent by the wind and the waves. You don't get the same feedback and feel on the wheel from the waves or the motion of the boat. Although at one point we had zero feedback on the wheel, but that was just because the wheel was disconnected because the steering chain had snapped. But even when it was connected, it felt more like the catamaran was wallowing across the ocean rather than giving a distinct response to the direct response to the feedback on the wheel.
In terms of the watch-keeping position or the helming position on the catamaran, this catamaran it was fully enclosed, which has some real benefits which we'll go into in a minute. But in terms of sailing feel, unless you have all of the clears surrounding you up when you're on watch, you don't get the same feeling of the wind on your face or the same feedback in terms of the environment around you. And one of the things that we really love about crossing an ocean on Florence is stargazing from the cockpit in the middle of the ocean on our night watches. And again on the catamaran, because you have that solid structure above your head, which as we mentioned has some real benefits, you also don't see the stars, and so you don't get that same viewpoint. There are places on the catamaran, or only one place on the catamaran, that you could get that same view, and that is right on the very front of the trampoline. But that's an unlikely position that you'd want to be alone on a night watch because it's quite exposed, even if you did have a working autopilot.
It's harder to judge the conditions on the catamaran because it doesn't give you any feedback on the wheel or in terms of heel, obviously, if you're overpressed with sail. So we ended up having to rely a lot more on the instruments.
And we didn't feel as connected to either the ocean or the boat on board the catamaran as we normally would do crossing an ocean on Florence. It's really hard to put into words, but the closest example that I can give is how connected you would feel to the environment if you were camping versus if you were staying in a luxury apartment. So the joy of sailing didn't really come to us on board the catamaran. It was more, the joy that we got was more from the joy of living well on board. Whereas on Florence we get a lot of joy from actually sailing the boat, which is a really good job because there's not a lot of joy from the comfort of living.
We enjoy trying to sail Florence as efficiently as possible and make the best use of the wind, and she gives a lot of feedback in terms of feel and speed so you get a lot of return on your investment of putting that effort into steering and trimming. Whereas on the Catamaran it felt like a big luxury box and you didn't really change the feel no matter how well or badly the sails were trimmed. So you ended up just not bothering and going to make a comfortable cup of tea instead.
Yeah. So overall, in terms of sailing feel, it's probably a very personal thing, but for us, there is absolutely no comparison. The Monohull wins, hands down.
Well done, Florence. Moving on to sailing comfort, and Florence, this is where you need to stop listening, I'm afraid, because unfortunately she just can't really compete with the Catamaran in this section. Catamarans are so much more comfortable. On the Cat, the motion, it's a different motion, and people do talk about the difference between the two. It's not stable. Some people hate the motion of the Catamaran. We just found it to be a higher frequency motion, so the boat moves quite quickly between the waves because you've got multiple waves under the hulls at the same time, but it doesn't move anywhere near as far, whereas Florence will really roll from side to side. The Catamaran had a quicker movement but a smaller amplitude, higher frequency, smaller amplitude, and we found that much more comfortable on board.
Yeah, much easier to walk around.
One of the things that's really noticeable sailing on a catamaran is the lack of motion in comparison to sailing Florence or a Monohull, and the fact that you can just walk around the boat. Sometimes it's a bit of a drunken stumble if the waves are a bit bigger, but yeah, the majority of the time it's really easy to move around, and so we move around a lot more than we do when we're sailing on Florence.
But it also made a big difference when we were keeping watch, because that enclosed watch-keeping position just meant that we were comfortably removed from the elements, so we didn't tire anywhere near as quickly.
And the solid roof over the helm position and the forward and aft cockpits meant that we were really well protected from the sun. On Florence, we're always looking for a bit of shade under the bimini as the sun moves round. We're always hiding from the sun in the tropics, so that just made life a lot more comfortable as well. We didn't have to be slathered in sun cream all the time.
Yeah.
It's not just the sailing which is much more comfortable on board the Catamaran, but general just life at sea. And a big part of that is cooking. It was actually much easier, even cooking for 4 on board the Catamaran, than it ever is cooking for the 2 of us on board Florence. And there are a number of reasons for that, not just the motion on board, but the fact that I was cooking on a full-sized oven with a much larger work surface area. We've got access to a fridge and a freezer, so you've got much more options in terms of meals. Things don't roll off the side, they stay put if you put them down. And that comes to also eating. You can eat off a plate with 2 utensils rather than having to hold the bowl with one arm. Sometimes hook your other arm around a winch, like we have to on Florence, and just have one utensil for your food. So yeah, very, very different experience, both cooking and eating on board the Catamaran.
There's also space for 4 people to move around easily without having to shimmy past each other like even we do just with 2 people on Florence. And then because you've got so much more space, we had 2 couples on board, so we each had a hull per couple, so you had a whole load of personal space, and the sleeping area is tucked down in a hull away from whoever's on watch, whereas on Florence the person is in the saloon, laid down there, and your head is 2 meters away from the stove. So if the person on watch wants to go down and make a cup of tea, they're going to be disturbing the person who is off watch. Whereas on the Catamaran, you didn't have to worry about that. You could wander around, make a cup. Well, when we had a working autopilot, you could wander around and make a cup of tea. When we didn't have a working autopilot, you had to heave to, even if you needed to go to the loo. So that was a bit of a different experience. But overall, it was just so much more comfortable to live, and you were therefore so much more rested. You weren't disturbed in your sleep. You're so much more rested on board that you were more alert for your watch.
The noise on board was different but similar. I don't think sailing across an ocean on any boat is peaceful. Both have waves hitting the side of the hull and the noise of the sails slatting, and also the noises of winches, although electric winches are much more noisy than manual winches. We did experience the waves slamming on the Catamaran underneath the bridge deck, which is a problem that a lot of people do talk about. And it does make a really loud bang, and it is disconcerting at times because it makes the whole table jump. But we felt we kind of got used to that. There wasn't a condition, we weren't in conditions where that was happening on such a regular basis. It became a real problem. But friends who sail catamarans do mention that this is a big issue affecting comfort at sea.
But overall, the Catamaran wins hands down on comfort at sea. And although we're talking about comparing these boats on an ocean crossing, obviously we were at anchor in the Caribbean as well. And it's not really worth mentioning, a Catamaran completely and utterly wipes out a Monohull for comfort at anchor. It is just a luxury floating apartment with your own dock, all there nice and stable for you in the anchorage. So yeah, unfortunately Florence, a Catamaran wins massively on comfort at sea and at anchor.
So the final section for comparison is all-weather ocean capability and safety. And this is very different from sailing performance or sailing comfort, but we feel a much bigger factor and much more important factor when it comes to sailing a boat across an ocean. So the Catamaran had the enclosed helm station, and also the whole aft cockpit had enclosure around the side of them. So we had a feeling of being more protected on board the Catamaran and less like we were going to fall overboard. Although if the canopy hadn't have been there on the helm station, then there is a huge gap down the side that you could still fall out of. And so we did clip on whenever the seas were bigger, even when at the helm.
There's less motion on board, so we felt that we'd be less likely to fall over on the Catamaran. However, if we did fall, then there was much further to fall. There weren't any handholds, and it did feel quite dangerous that you could fall down the steps out of the helm station or down the steps into one of the hulls. Working with a spinnaker on the bow, there is a lot more space on the bow. You're not on the narrow bow like you are on Florence or on Monohull, so that was a lot safer because you're further away from the edge of the boat. The high boom though did make it difficult when we had to do the repairs and fix the batten on the boom. You're a long way up even though the boat's not moving around quite as much, so that was a little bit more dangerous.
That enclosed watchkeeping position, a very raised position, so it improves the visibility, which really helps when you're sailing in waves because you can see kind of over the top of them, whereas on Florence we've sometimes got to wait for a ship to appear on the crest of a wave because we are that bit lower down. But that helm keeping position is also on the side of a very wide boat, so although it gives a really good visibility of kind of distance and it's easier to spot things a long way off, it can be really hard to spot things that are close to the boat on the opposite side. So yeah, that was really apparent when Ron spotted that turtle because he could see it a long way off, but then when we tried to come alongside it with it on the opposite side to the helm station, he couldn't see a thing.
Okay, it's dead ahead, dead in front of the port bow now.
Yeah, just something worth bearing in mind for, I guess, a man overboard situation.
Yes! The Cat is very open at the back, and the following seas did come inside at times, even though we didn't see anything more than about 3.5 metres with an 8-second period on this trip. We have often experienced bigger waves than that on Florence, and very occasionally they've been big enough to break into the cockpit and fill the cockpit on Florence. If you had a similar wave on that catamaran, then it would have filled the dinghy, flooded the aft cockpit, and possibly flooded through into the saloon. So that would have been a little bit worry. And although we felt safe with the canopy surrounding us, in reality, we weren't safe from the ocean waves still. And there are a lot of places for water to get into the Cat. There's a lot more opening hatches that you need to remember to close so that you don't get waves flooding in.
And a lot more windows as well. Yeah, so the catamaran has also the engine compartments are right at the back of the boat on the very aft of the hull, and they're open to the ocean waves if you do need to access those. We were really lucky that when the steering broke, the waves had actually reduced in size, so they were only just getting up to those hatches. And not all catamarans have the engines in those positions, and some do have access from the inside, but that is generally the case, that you can access the engine and the steering from inside the boat on a monohull. And a monohull also generally has a much more usable emergency tiller if you do have a steering failure.
Because it's in the middle of the boat, not exposed out on the corner of the catamaran. Although we didn't experience a gale or very strong winds when we were sailing the catamaran across the Atlantic, just a couple of squalls up to 45 knots, it was very apparent how much windage there was on the catamaran, even when we'd taken all of the sails down, and we didn't have any options to slow down, such as storm sails or a drogue. We would far rather be on Florence in bad weather. Because she is set up for ocean sailing, she has all the equipment for exploring remote areas away from support, with redundancy of systems for all the electronics, a complete independent spare autopilot in the form of the wind vane on the back of the boat, and all of the storm sails, etc. And also a usable emergency tiller that sits in the middle of the boat, where you're still in the protection of the cockpit and you can see all the instruments for navigation. Also, it can't be ignored that on the catamaran, in those bad weather conditions, you cannot get away from the fact that there is that much windage. And with a with a monohull, you do have the ability to sail upwind with storm sails and get yourself out of a bad situation if you need to.
Yeah, so irrelevant of the cat versus monohull debate, we would, for ocean passengers, choose to forgo some comforts in return for a solid, capable boat with backup systems on board as well. But in terms of ocean safety and all-weather capability, our choice, as it's probably clear, would be for a monohull or a boat like Florence. So for us, overall, the choice of cat versus mono is very much dependent on the type of sailing that we want to do, the locations that we plan to visit, and the likelihood of storms and big seas in those areas. So if we were to sail across to the Caribbean or be crossing the Pacific again via the trade wind route, then if we ignore cost, then we would definitely consider a catamaran. But it still wouldn't be without reservation, because even in those areas we have encountered really bad weather. If we were to cross the Indian Ocean again, or be rounding South Africa via the Cape of Storms, or even down to New Zealand, or sailing higher latitudes, then we'd be much more likely to experience a wider variety of wind angles and severe weather conditions. And so in those conditions we would much prefer a monohull.
Which brings us to the question, are we going to buy a catamaran? Well, you've probably guessed it, but the short answer is no. And it's got nothing to do with performance or comfort. The two main reasons are cost and where we want to sail. A catamaran that is as capable as Florence would cost many times the value that we could sell Florence for. So really, that is just out of the question for us. And also, we would want to sail Florence to higher latitudes where we feel that she's going to be a much safer and more capable boat for what we want to achieve. Perhaps if we had sailed a different catamaran that was more designed for ocean crossing and sort of cruising expedition style, we would have a different opinion. The luxury was really nice, but the sailing failed to win us over. If we were going to change the sort of thing that we do, I mean, we really enjoy sailing, which is why we do what we do, but if we were to change to not moving as much and more living aboard than sailing, then we would change to the luxury of a catamaran in a heartbeat.
After the crossing, our patrons had some questions about the trip, and most of them we have covered in the previous sections, but there are a few that we still haven't addressed, so we'll do that now. So both Duncan and Steve asked, how do we decide what spares and tools to take for long-term ocean cruising and ocean crossings?
So we'll start with tools. When we left on Florence way back in 2016, I just took all of my hand tools that we could fit on board with us, took everything apart from a tap and die set. And halfway around the world later, I regretted not having the tap and die set, as I really needed to tap out some aluminium threads on the steering pedestal. So I would advise to take all of the hand tools that you have and that you're used to using, because you're going to have to be able to maintain everything on board. And from a power tool side of things, obviously these days with our new power system we can run power tools, that's not a problem, but those days I took a battery drill, that was pretty essential, and a Dremel came in really useful for a lot of things. And on the spares side of things, that is difficult to work out what to take, because you could sink the boat with the amount of spares if you tried to work out everything that could possibly fail.
And your wallet.
And your wallet, yes, very true. So on Florence we try to be single fault tolerant. So if any one thing breaks, we can either do without it, have a spare on board to replace it, have the spares and tools to fix it, or if we can't do any of those things, then we have to mitigate against that failure happening. So we'll give some examples. If the fridge broke, we can simply do without it. If the electric autopilot broke, then we have a completely independent system in our mechanical wind vane self-steering, so we could still carry on no matter without an electric autopilot. If a sail rips, then we have a sail repair kit and we can sew it back together and we can fix it. But if the mast broke, well, obviously we can't do without it, but there's no way we can carry a spare mast or spare rigging or whatever was going to break to cause the mast to fall down. So we have to be very careful to make sure that the mast doesn't fall down. So we do a careful rig inspection before any ocean passage and also after any strong winds, and we had a lesson from a rigger in how to do this, so that we try to make sure that we're not going to have the problem of the mast falling down. And we also always fill the fuel tank to the max before any ocean crossing, so that in event of a rig failure we have the maximum motoring range to get us out of trouble.
Yeah, so we basically, before any major ocean passage or if we're going somewhere remote, we just go over the whole boat and the systems that we use for both living on board and sailing her, and with those questions in mind. So the next question, Steve asked, how and in which ways have the experiences of your previous crossings benefited you or prepared you for this crossing? And did that make the emergency easier to handle?
The emergency Steve is referring to here is when the steering completely failed hundreds of miles from land.
Our previous experience of crossing oceans did help us to deal with the situation with much clearer heads and without panicking when it happened. However, we didn't know the boat very well at all. And so Ron, the boat owner's experience of having rebuilt the boat and knowing where all of the parts of the steering system were led to was absolutely invaluable in terms of fixing the problem. We'd have probably found the issue just as quickly, the source of the issue, just as quickly ourselves, but then fixing that problem would have taken much longer without the knowledge of the boat. So it's worth having a very in-depth knowledge of the boat that you're sailing before you set off across an ocean.
Yeah, it's a good point to mention though, because our approach to sailing across an ocean has changed massively over the years. The more ocean experience we've gained, the more cautious and safety conscious we've become. So we don't sail our boat anywhere near as hard as we used to. We actually sail about a knot slower than we used to do. We don't push it anywhere near as hard, so we don't put as much strain on the boat or on us. And that means that when an incident like this happens, we are more rested. So we have more capacity left within ourselves to deal with the situation instead of just being knackered from pushing the boat to the limits and pushing ourselves to the limits across the ocean.
That's a theory.
That's a theory. Theory is we have more left in reserve. Well, it did work in this situation.
So Tom asked about health at sea. How do we cope if one of us is ill, and how does it affect our watch system? First of all, prevention is better than cure. because once you're out at sea, it's very hard to recover if you are ill. We were both ill with a bout of flu before we set off across the Atlantic, and in hindsight we should have left it another week before leaving, because doing night watches and also the motion of the boat at sea doesn't make it easy for your body to rest and recover. And it's your responsibility as a crew member, not just when you're ill, but at any time, to make sure that you're as well rested as possible in your off watches. So really taking the time to take that
to try and sleep, even though you're in a bouncy, noisy environment and it's daylight and can be difficult to sleep, just to try and get in your cabin and get your head down.
So you're ready to take over when you need to. I mean, if you've got enough crew on board, then you can potentially take that ill person out of the watch system, but that does put more stress onto the rest of the crew.
Another way to cope is to sail the boat more conservatively, even more conservatively, to sail with smaller sail area, which can mean that, you know, when a squall approaches, maybe you don't actually need to put a reef in because you've already got a small amount of sail area up. So that means you don't have to expend that energy, so therefore your body can recover. But it can be tricky. If you've got enough crew, you can take someone out of the watch system, but for Amy and I, there's only two of us. So when we're sailing Florence, if one of us is ill, we just have to cope. And when we were sailing up the coast of Namibia, I came down with a bout of shingles as we were sailing up the coast, and I couldn't turn a winch. It was incredibly painful for me to do anything to move. So we sailed very conservatively with extra reefs in, and I still had to stand my watch and keep watch, but I was just sat in the cockpit. And if we needed to do anything with the sails, then I had to wake Amy up to come and do that. And I wanted to limit the amount I woke her up because she needed to get her sleep so she could stand the next watch. So you do just have to cope at times. There's not a lot you can do when there's only two of you. When there's four, you've got a lot more options. Mark had very similar questions about the experience of sailing as a crew on someone else's boat rather than our own Florence. How can one be successful joining others, friends or otherwise, in the confined quarters of a yacht for a weeks-long open ocean cruise? And crewing on someone else's boat is challenging, as it's hard to really know the skipper or the boat before you show up. What advice would you give, or what would you do differently in the future given a similar situation?
I think time invested in a shorter straight down sail would be a really great investment. We wouldn't recommend setting out across an ocean on a boat that you don't know, even if you know the skipper really well. And if you can, I know a lot of delivery skippers do this, but take your own safety gear. So life jacket, spare charts, EPIRB, spotlight even, so that you can take responsibility for your own safety and have equipment that you feel safe and comfortable with.
Start the conversation about the trip early, well before departure. We'd suggest running through a list of what-if scenarios for different parts of the boat failing, just as we said about single fault tolerance before. It can feel rude to get on board someone else's boat and start asking questions about equipment, what spare parts are on board, and looking around. But if they take the responsibility of being a skipper seriously, they'll be happy and supportive of you doing so. After all, the more that you know, the more that you'll be able to be useful and help in the case of an emergency out on the open ocean.
It's also really good to allow as much time as possible so that you're not pressured into setting off on a particular day or arriving in time for, say, a flight, because it takes a lot of pressure out of the situation. And I think that's something that's irrelevant of whether you're sailing somebody else's boat or just sailing your own as well. It's just a really good thing to be able to do. We find it's really good to be able to agree some ground rules before a passage. So this is something that we actually still do together on Florence, despite the fact that we have both sailed together for quite a number of years. So some of the rules that work really well for us are that if one person wants to put a reef in, then it just happens. No questions are asked. We just both work together to put that reef in. But then it takes both of us to decide that that reef wants to come out again. So that's just a really simple, straightforward way of taking the stress out of that situation if one of you is feeling that the boat is overpressed. Another rule that works really well is that if we're making a decision and there's a disagreement about what choice we make, then we try to go with the most conservative and the safest option. And again, that's just to take the stress out of a potential stressful situation. We have a rule that life jackets must be worn at night by the person who is on watch, and that you are not supposed to go out of the cockpit without waking the other person up. And that just takes the stress out of the night watch situation for the person who is supposed to be sleeping down below, because they're not worried about the person who's on deck.
Yep. Everybody's attitude to risk is going to be different, and it is hard to understand this until you sail across an ocean with that person. It's difficult to know how even you will react to being out at sea until you've been in that situation before. So we would suggest, if you're joining a boat that you're not used to, arrive at the boat with the mindset that if you are not feeling 100% confident with the crew or the boat, then be prepared to walk away. Because once you set off out onto the ocean, it's very difficult to turn around and go back.
Yeah, after this experience, we'd be very hesitant to get on board another boat for a big crossing without having some experience of sailing it or having an intimate knowledge of how it's been prepared. And we'd feel very irresponsible to suggest that you should jump on board somebody's boat that you don't know very well.
A lot of people do that. Down in the Canaries, there's a lot of people waiting, just walking the docks to trying to hop on a boat. And although it can lead to an amazing experience, it is a big undertaking to cross an ocean, and preparing a boat for an ocean crossing is a huge undertaking as well. And having the knowledge that we have about sailing our own boat across an ocean, we'd be very nervous to do that ourselves. Sarah asked, what was it like sailing as part of a crew of 4 rather than just the 2 of us like we're used to? Actually, it was brilliant the whole time to have more people on board, but even better during the first few days when we had a working autopilot and the on-watch person wasn't stuck to the wheel, literally. We were more rested because we had more time off because of less time spent on watch with more people to do the jobs. We felt like we had more time to do everything, less rushed. On Florence, with just the 2 of us, we're normally trying to cram in filming, getting the weather, eating, fixing things between being on watch and sleeping, with hardly any downtime when we were awake. Whereas during the day on the Cat, it was rare for there to be less than 2 people up at any one time, so there was always someone to chat to and to be social with. But then during the nights, we had the solitude of night watch, which is something that we enjoy, so it was a really nice balance overall.
It was, and when we were cooking, we could sometimes even have 2 of us cooking at the same time. It wasn't just down to one person like it is on board Florence. And it was a nice social occasion to sit around, if we could, in the evenings and eat together as well. So overall, we found sailing with 4 on board the Catamaran a really enjoyable experience. And it's a shame really that we haven't been able to take crew on board Florence at times, but we would on board Florence be very much living on top of each other, whereas on the Catamaran there is space to really spread out, and each couple was able to have even a hull to themselves.
Yeah, so that made it a really enjoyable experience. That concludes our series on sailing across the Atlantic on the Catamaran. So now you know we're not going to buy a Catamaran. So what next then, I hear you ask?
Well, next time we are going to prepare Florence for all of those places that we wouldn't want to take a Catamaran to. First up, the Arctic.
For extra updates in between these bi-weekly videos, and to find out what we're up to in real time, head over to Patron and join the crew.
2, 1.
Oh, you cheater!
Of course, don't forget to subscribe to make sure that you don't miss the next episode here on YouTube.
Continuing our voyage on Florence would not be possible without the support of our patrons. Thank you to all of you, and especially to our star patrons.